The golden light from the crystal chandelier reflected off champagne glasses as 70 voices filled Romano's restaurant with celebration. My father's 70th birthday party was supposed to be perfect. 3 generations of our family gathered around elegant mahogany tables sharing stories and laughter, while servers weaved between us carrying silver trays. Dad looked distinguished in his navy blazer, his silver hair combed perfectly as always. My son Jake sat beside me wearing the new button-down shirt we'd picked out together that morning. He'd been excited about tonight, asking if Grandpa would like the handmade birthday card he'd spent hours creating. Then Dad stood up, raised his champagne glass, and delivered words that shattered my world. He called my sister Sarah his greatest gift and thanked her for giving him 2 perfect grandchildren. Jake looked straight at me, his 10-year-old eyes filling with confusion and pain, and whispered, "But what about me?" I felt my chest tighten as silence blanketed the room. Every family member turned their attention toward our table, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Jake's lower lip trembled slightly, and I could see him struggling to understand why Grandpa had forgotten about him completely. My sister Sarah beamed from across the room, soaking up the praise while her twin daughters Emma and Grace giggled beside her. Her husband Marcus raised his glass in acknowledgement, smiling broadly at the recognition. But Jake just stared down at his untouched slice of chocolate cake, the birthday card he'd made lying folded beside his plate. I remembered how carefully he'd drawn a picture of himself and his grandfather fishing together, writing, "Happy birthday to the best grandpa ever," in his careful cursive handwriting. Now that card seemed like evidence of a relationship that existed only in a 10-year-old's hopeful imagination. My father continued his toast, praising Sarah's accomplishments as a mother and her dedication to family values. He spoke about how proud he was to watch Emma and Grace grow into beautiful young ladies, how they brought such joy to his retirement years. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of Jake's sense of belonging. I watched my son's shoulders slump as he processed the reality that his grandfather apparently didn't consider him worthy of mention. The weight of the moment pressed down on me like a physical force. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or thoughtless words. This was about my son's understanding of his place in our family, his sense of worth and belonging. Jake had already lost his mother before he could even form memories of her. Now it seemed like he was learning that his existence didn't matter enough to his grandfather to warrant even a passing mention in a birthday toast. I could feel the expectant energy in the room as family members waited to see how this awkward moment would resolve itself. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed oblivious to the pain they'd just witnessed. Sarah caught my eye and shrugged slightly as if to say that Dad's favoritism wasn't her responsibility. Her casual dismissal of Jake's hurt ignited something fierce inside me. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through the murmured conversations. Every eye in the restaurant fixed on me as I lifted my own champagne glass, the crystal catching the light and sending tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. My heart pounded against my ribs, but Jake needed to see his father stand up for him. He needed to understand that someone in this family recognized his worth. Dad, that was a beautiful toast. I began, my voice carrying clearly across the room. Sarah's children are indeed wonderful. But I'd like to add something about gifts and grandchildren that I think everyone should hear. The room fell completely silent. Even the servers stopped moving, sensing the gravity of the moment. My father's eyebrows drew together in confusion, while Sarah's confident smile began to waver. You see, Jake here is also your grandchild, and he represents the most precious kind of gift imaginable. His mother, my beautiful wife Lisa, died bringing him into this world. She sacrificed her life so that Jake could live. That makes him not just a gift, but a gift that was purchased with the ultimate price. My voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by years of suppressed frustration and a father's protective instinct. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like hope. I reached down and placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling him straighten under my touch. While we're talking about perfect grandchildren, I continued, let me tell you about this boy. Jake gets straight A's in school. He volunteers at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. He's learned to cook dinner for us both because he wants to help out around the house. He saved his allowance for 3 months to buy his mother flowers for her grave on Mother's Day. And he spent 2 hours yesterday making that birthday card because he loves his grandfather so much. The silence stretched taut as my words sank in. I saw Aunt Charlotte dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, while Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Cousin Danny's teenage daughters were staring at Jake with new interest, as if seeing him for the first time. So yes, Dad Sarah gave you 2 wonderful granddaughters. But let's not forget that Jake is sitting right here listening to every word, wondering why his existence isn't worth mentioning. He's lost enough in his young life. He doesn't deserve to lose his sense of belonging in this family too. My father's face had gone completely pale. The champagne glass in his hand trembled slightly as the implications of his oversight hit him. Around the room, family members exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing they'd all been complicit in Jake's exclusion. But it was Sarah's reaction that truly shocked me. Instead of looking apologetic or embarrassed, her expression hardened into something cold and calculating. She stood up abruptly, her chair nearly toppling backward. "How dare you," she hissed, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "How dare you turn Dad's birthday into some pathetic plea for attention? You've always been jealous that my children have 2 parents who can actually provide for them properly." The cruelty in her words hit me like a physical blow. Around the room, gasps echoed as family members processed what she'd just said. But Sarah wasn't finished. "You want to know the truth?" She continued, her voice rising with each word. "I've been trying to protect Dad from the reality of your situation for years. A single father struggling to raise a child alone, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet, no stable home environment. Is it any wonder that Dad gravitates toward my family instead of your train wreck?" The restaurant had gone completely quiet now. Even diners at other tables had stopped their conversations to watch our family drama unfold. Jake's face crumpled, and I felt rage building in my chest like molten lava. But then Sarah made a mistake that would change everything. In her fury, she let slip the truth that she'd been hiding for years. Dad's will leaves everything to you because you're his only son. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to change his mind about that ridiculous, outdated tradition. My children deserve that inheritance more than Jake does. They have potential, they have futures that matter. Maybe if Dad understood what kind of father you really are, he'd make the right decision about where his money should go. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah's admission that she'd been actively working to turn our father against me and Jake revealed a level of manipulation that stunned everyone present. Her motivation wasn't love or protection, it was greed masked as concern. My father's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the dead silence. His eyes darted between Sarah and me, understanding dawning on his face that he'd been played for a fool. The shattered champagne glass crunched under Sarah's heels as she stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. She'd revealed too much, said things that couldn't be taken back, and now she was scrambling to regain control of the situation. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her attack. "You want the whole truth." Sarah's voice carried across the restaurant with venomous intensity. "Fine, let's talk about truth. I've been protecting this family from Ernest's irresponsible choices for years. Dad, do you know he's been borrowing money from loan sharks to pay for Jake's private school? You know he works overnight shifts at the warehouse and leaves Jake alone for hours?" Each lie hit me like a physical assault. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Sarah steamrolled forward, her desperation making her reckless. I've been the one calling you when Jake was sick and Ernest was nowhere to be found. I've been the one making sure Jake had decent clothes when Ernest couldn't afford them. I've been trying to show you that my family is stable, responsible, worthy of your trust and your legacy." The manipulation in her words was breathtaking. She'd twisted every act of normal single parenting into evidence of neglect, every financial struggle into proof of unfitness. But what shocked me most was realizing that she'd been feeding these lies to our father, systematically building a case against me, one fabricated crisis at a time. Jake tugged on my sleeve, confusion written across his features. "Dad, what's Aunt Sarah talking about? When was I ever alone? When was I sick and you weren't there?" Before I could answer, Aunt Charlotte's voice rang out from the corner table where she'd been sitting quietly with the older family members. "Sarah, that's enough." Her tone carried the authority of someone who'd watched our family dynamics for 7 decades. "I think it's time everyone learned what's really been happening here." Charlotte stood up slowly, her arthritis making the movement deliberate and painful. At 85, she was the family matriarch, respected by everyone for her wisdom and honesty. When she spoke, people listened. "I've been watching this manipulation for months." Charlotte began, her voice steady despite her age. "Sarah, you've been calling your father almost daily with stories about Ernest's supposed failures as a parent. You've been painting pictures of neglect and irresponsibility that simply don't exist." The room held its collective breath as Charlotte continued. "I live 6 blocks from Ernest and Jake. I see them together constantly. I watch Jake walk to the bus stop every morning well-fed and properly dressed. I see Ernest at every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every baseball game. I've never once seen evidence of the neglect you've been describing to your father." Sarah's face went white as Charlotte's words dismantled her carefully constructed narrative. "That's not... You don't understand the whole situation." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Charlotte interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "You've been systematically poisoning your father's mind against his own son and grandson because you're terrified of being left out of his will. You've been manufacturing crises and playing the concerned sister while plotting to steal your brother's inheritance." The accusation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Family members exchanged shocked glances as the true scope of Sarah's deception became clear. She hadn't been protecting anyone, she'd been orchestrating a campaign to destroy my relationship with my father. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Sarah, is this true? Have you been lying about Ernest?" "I haven't been lying," Sarah shot back. But her voice lacked conviction. "I've been concerned." There's a difference between concerned about what exactly. Charlotte's question cut through Sarah's deflection like a knife. About Jake's excellent grades, about Ernest's perfect attendance at school events, about the way that boy lights up whenever he talks about his father. I felt Jake's hand slip into mine, his small fingers squeezing tight as he processed the revelation that his aunt had been lying about us. The hurt in his eyes was being replaced by something else, a growing understanding that the problem wasn't with him or me, but with Sarah's jealousy and greed. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, tell me Charlotte is wrong. Tell me you haven't been lying to me about Ernest and Jake." The silence that followed his question was deafening. Sarah looked around the room, desperately searching for support that wasn't there. Every face she met reflected disappointment, shock, or outright anger at her deception. "Dad, I was trying to protect you from..." she began, but the words died in her throat. She couldn't finish the sentence because there was no way to justify what she'd done. But as devastating as these revelations were, none of us were prepared for what happened next. Marcus, Sarah's husband, chose that moment to stumble through the restaurant's front door, his shirt wrinkled and his tie askew, clearly having spent the evening drinking somewhere other than his father-in-law's birthday celebration. Marcus weaved between the tables with the unsteady gait of someone who'd spent hours at the bottom of a bottle. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and stained his normally perfect hair, falling across his forehead in greasy strands. The strong smell of whiskey preceded him as he approached our family gathering drawing stares from other restaurant patrons. "Sorry I'm late." He slurred his words running together as he grabbed the back of an empty chair for support. "Had to stop at Murphy's bar to celebrate. Today's my lucky day, everyone. Finally hit the jackpot at the poker table." Sarah's face went from pale to green as she watched her husband make a spectacle of himself. She tried to catch his attention, making frantic gesturing motions to get him to stop talking, but Marcus was too drunk to notice her distress signals. "You know what's funny?" Marcus continued swaying slightly as he pointed around the room. "Everyone thinks I've got a gambling problem, but look who's talking now. Won back almost $2,000 tonight. Of course, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to what I've lost, but hey, it's a start, right?" The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the soft clinking of silverware from nearby tables. Our family sat frozen watching this disaster unfold with the horrified fascination of witnesses to a car crash. My father's eyes narrowed as he processed Marcus's words. "What do you mean what you've lost?" "Oh, come on, Dad." Marcus laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "Don't pretend you don't know. Sarah's been keeping you updated on all my failures, right? The house we lost last month, the kids' college funds, I gambled away, the credit cards, I maxed out chasing that one big win." Each revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah's daughters, Emma and Grace, looked mortified, their teenage faces flushing with embarrassment as their father exposed their family's financial devastation in front of everyone. "Marcus, shut up," Sarah hissed, her voice barely controlled. "You're drunk. You don't know what you're saying." But Marcus was beyond caring about consequences. "Know what I'm saying? I'm saying your precious daughter has been stealing money from you to cover my debts. How do you think we've been keeping up appearances all these months? Sarah's been forging your signature on withdrawal slips, taking money from your savings accounts to pay off loan sharks." The words hit my father like a physical attack. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as the blood drained from his face. "What did you just say? 3 months ago when I owed Big Tony $15,000 and he threatened to break my legs, your loving daughter decided to help herself to your retirement fund. Been happening ever since. Couple hundred here, 1,000 there. She's gotten real good at copying your handwriting." The silence that followed Marcus's confession was absolute. Even the ambient noise from the kitchen seemed to stop as everyone processed the magnitude of what they just heard. Sarah hadn't just been lying about me to manipulate our father's affections. She'd been actively stealing from him to enable her husband's gambling addiction. My father's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, please tell me this isn't true." Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. The confident manipulator who'd been systematically destroying my reputation was suddenly revealed as a common thief caught red-handed by her own husband's drunken confessions. "Dad, I can explain," she finally managed, but her voice shook with desperation. "It wasn't stealing. I was going to pay it back. Marcus promised he was getting help, that he'd stop gambling if I could just get him out from under these debts." "How much?" Dad's question was simple, direct, and devastating. Marcus answered before Sarah could stop him. "Started with $5,000 to pay off Tony, then another $3,000 for the credit card minimums, then $8,000 more when I had that sure thing at the track that didn't pan out. Last week she took $1,200 for—" He paused, swaying as he tried to remember. "What was last week for honey?" "Stop talking," Sarah pleaded, but it was too late. The damage was done, the truth was out, and there was no way to put it back in the box. Uncle Robert had pulled out his phone and was quietly speaking to someone, probably calling the bank to check on Dad's accounts. Cousin Danny was comforting his daughters, who looked traumatized by the revelations about their aunt and uncle. Aunt Charlotte was shaking her head sadly, her expression a mixture of disappointment and vindication. But it was Jake's reaction that broke my heart. He was staring at his aunt with genuine confusion, trying to understand how someone he'd trusted could be capable of such betrayal. Dad, why would Aunt Sarah take Grandpa's money? Before I could answer, Marcus provided his own explanation. Because your daddy here was supposed to get all the money when Grandpa dies, and your aunt thinks that's unfair, so she figured if she could prove your dad was a terrible father and get herself named in the will, instead then she could pay me back and keep the rest. The casual way Marcus explained their scheme, as if it were perfectly reasonable to steal from an elderly man and destroy his relationship with his son and grandson, was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire revelation. My father stood up suddenly, his chair falling backward with a crash. For a moment I thought he might be having a heart attack. His face was flushed, his breathing labored, and his hands were shaking with what I realized was not shock but pure rage. "Get out!" He said, his voice low and dangerous. "Both of you get out of my sight before I call the police right now." But Marcus wasn't finished destroying his wife's carefully constructed facade. "Police? That's funny because Sarah was planning to call them on Ernest. Had this whole story worked out about how he was stealing from you, using your confusion and age against you. She's got documents and everything ready to frame him for elder abuse while she's the one who's been robbing you blind." The final piece of Sarah's plan clicked into place with horrifying clarity. She hadn't just been stealing Dad's money and lying about me, she'd been preparing to frame me for her own crimes. The systematic character assassination, the false stories about my parenting, the manufactured concerns about my financial situation, they were all building toward a moment when she could point the finger at me and claim I was the one manipulating and stealing from our father. The restaurant manager approached our table cautiously, clearly concerned about the escalating family drama that was disturbing other diners. Before he could speak, though, Aunt Charlotte's voice cut through the chaos with startling authority. "There's something else everyone needs to know," she announced, her aged hands trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. "Something about Lisa's death that's been weighing on my conscience for 10 years. Every head turned toward Charlotte as she pulled out a small bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. Jake's eyes widened when he saw them, recognizing something significant, even if he didn't understand what. "These are letters your mother wrote to me during her pregnancy, yeah," Charlotte said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Letters I should have shared years ago, but I was trying to protect everyone from painful truths." My heart began racing as Charlotte untied the ribbon with shaking fingers. Lisa had been close to Charlotte, often visiting her during her pregnancy, when I was working extra shifts to prepare for the baby's arrival. But I'd never known about any correspondence between them. Lisa didn't die from normal childbirth complications. Charlotte continued, her words falling like stones into still water. "She died from stress-induced cardiac arrest brought on by severe anxiety and emotional trauma during her final months of pregnancy." The confession hit me like a freight train. I'd always been told that Lisa suffered from preeclampsia that led to complications during delivery. The doctors had said it was unpredictable, unavoidable, just one of those tragic things that sometimes happen. What kind of emotional trauma? I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Charlotte's eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression of profound sadness and disappointment. The trauma of believing her husband was unfaithful, that their marriage was falling apart, that she was bringing a child into a broken home. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went completely white as she realized where Charlotte's revelation was heading. "Your sister, Charlotte," continued, her voice gaining strength, "spent months during Lisa's pregnancy calling her with stories about Ernest's supposed affairs. Anonymous phone calls describing fictional encounters with other women, mysterious evidence of infidelity that never existed, constant suggestions that Ernest was planning to leave once the baby was born." The words hit me like physical blows. Lisa had grown distant during her final months of pregnancy, anxious and suspicious in ways that had confused and hurt me. I'd attributed it to hormonal changes and pregnancy stress, never imagining that someone was deliberately feeding her lies about my faithfulness. Sarah convinced Lisa that Ernest was only staying with her out of obligation, that he resented the pregnancy, that he was planning to abandon them both as soon as the baby arrived. Charlotte's voice cracked with emotion. Lisa spent her final weeks convinced that her marriage was a lie and her child would grow up without a father. Jake's hand found mine squeezing tight as he processed this new information about his mother's death. The revelation that Sarah had been tormenting Lisa during her pregnancy was almost too horrible to believe. The night Lisa went into labor, Charlotte continued pulling a specific letter from the bundle. She called me crying, convinced that Ernest wouldn't even come to the hospital because he didn't really want the baby. Sarah had called her that afternoon with a story about seeing Ernest with another woman, telling her that he'd already checked out of their marriage emotionally. I remembered that night with crystal clarity. Lisa had seemed terrified not of the birth, but of something else, something she wouldn't explain. I'd assumed it was normal fear about becoming a parent, but now I understood it was something much more sinister. Lisa's blood pressure spiked during labor because she was convinced she was facing motherhood alone. Charlotte's voice was barely more than a whisper now. The stress and anxiety that Sarah had been feeding her for months finally overwhelmed her system. Her heart couldn't handle the emotional trauma on top of the physical strain of childbirth. The revelation reframed everything I thought I knew about my wife's death. Lisa hadn't died from a random medical complication. She'd died from the psychological torture my sister had inflicted on her during the most vulnerable period of her life. Why, the word escaped my lips as barely more than a breath. Why would Sarah do that to Lisa? To me, Charlotte's eyes were wet with unshed tears as she answered. Because even then she was jealous of your relationship with your father. She saw Lisa's pregnancy as another way you were securing your position as the favored child, the one who would carry on the family name and inherit everything. She wanted to destroy your marriage and drive you away from the family. The scope of Sarah's malice was breathtaking. She'd been willing to psychologically torture a pregnant woman to death just to improve her own standing in our father's eyes. She'd murdered my wife as surely as if she'd used a weapon, and she'd let me believe for 10 years that Lisa's death was just a tragic accident. Jake's voice was small and confused when he finally spoke. Aunt Sarah killed my mom. The innocent question hung in the air like an accusation. Around the room, family members sat in stunned silence as they grappled with the magnitude of what Charlotte had revealed. Sarah hadn't just been lying and stealing. She'd been systematically destroying lives for over a decade. My father's voice when he finally found it was thick with grief and rage. Sarah, is this true? Did you torture Lisa during her pregnancy? Did you cause her death? Sarah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her face cycling through expressions of denial, panic, and desperate calculation. But Marcus, still drunk and oblivious to the gravity of the moment, provided the final nail in her coffin. Of course it's true, he slurred. Sarah's been bragging about how she broke up Ernest's perfect little marriage for years. Says it was the smartest thing she ever did, getting rid of the competition for Daddy's affections. The casual confirmation of Lisa's murder broke something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Several family members gasped audibly, while others began quietly crying. The realization that we'd all been living with Lisa's killer, celebrating holidays with her, trusting her with our own families, was too horrific to fully process. As the weight of Charlotte's revelations settled over the room, like a suffocating blanket, Sarah's designer handbag slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. The impact caused the bag to tip over, spilling its contents across the restaurant's polished hardwood floor. Among the typical items you'd expect to find, wallet, keys, lipstick, phone, several official-looking documents scattered near my feet. Jake, ever curious and helpful, instinctively bent down to gather the papers, but as he picked them up, one particular document caught his attention. "Dad, why does this paper have my name on it?" Jake asked innocently, holding up a legal document with the header of Patterson, Williams and Associates Family Law. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the law firm's letterhead. They specialized in custody disputes and child welfare cases. With a growing sense of dread, I took the document from Jake's small hands and began reading, my eyes scanning the legal terminology with increasing horror. The document was a preliminary custody evaluation request filed by Sarah Henderson on behalf of her father, Harold Morrison, citing concerns about the welfare and safety of minor child Jacob Morrison, currently in the custody of Ernest Morrison. The petition requested immediate intervention by Child Protective Services and emergency custody placement with responsible family members pending a full investigation. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the shocked murmurs around the room. But even as I asked the question, more documents revealed themselves among the scattered contents of Sarah's purse. Legal briefs, character witness statements, financial records, medical reports, an entire arsenal of fabricated evidence designed to paint me as an unfit parent. Sarah lunged forward trying to gather the incriminating papers, but Uncle Robert was faster, scooping up several documents before she could reach them. Petition for emergency custody. He read aloud, his voice filled with disbelief. Allegations of child neglect, financial instability, inappropriate living conditions. This is insane, I breathed, rifling through the papers. Sarah, you were planning to steal my son. But the documents revealed a conspiracy far more elaborate than simple custody grabbing. Sarah had been building a case for months, documenting false incidents, manufacturing evidence, even recruiting witnesses who would testify to Jake's supposed neglect and my supposed instability. One particularly damning document was a medical report claiming Jake had been treated for malnutrition and showing signs of emotional abuse. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Sarah's neighbor, who happened to be a pediatrician. Another was a school report, allegedly from Jake's teacher, expressing concerns about his hygiene and behavior, despite the fact that Jake's actual teachers had never raised any such issues. "You forged medical records," I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. "You created fake school reports. You manufactured an entire fictional case against me." Jake pressed closer to my side, his young mind struggling to understand why his aunt would want to take him away from the only parent he'd ever known. "Dad, I don't want to live with Aunt Sarah. Why would she think I'm not happy with you?" The innocence in his question highlighted the cruelty of Sarah's scheme. Jake was a well-adjusted, happy child who loved his life with me. There was no legitimate reason for anyone to question our living situation, which meant Sarah's motivation had nothing to do with his welfare. Cousin Danny had found another document that revealed the true scope of Sarah's plan. "This is a financial projection," he announced, his voice grim. "It calculates the potential inheritance value if Jake were to be adopted by Sarah and raised as her legal child, ensuring she becomes the primary beneficiary of Dad's estate." The calculation was cold and methodical. By gaining custody of Jake, Sarah would position herself as the caretaker of Dad's only grandchild, strengthening her emotional claim to his wealth while simultaneously eliminating me as a rival heir. The plan was to use the fabricated custody case to paint me as an unfit father, then swoop in as the responsible family member willing to sacrifice her own comfort to raise her nephew properly. "There's more," Aunt Charlotte said quietly, picking up a letter that had fallen near her feet. "This appears to be correspondence with a private investigator, someone Sarah hired to follow Ernest and Jake, looking for evidence of neglect or inappropriate behavior." The letter detailed months of surveillance that had yielded nothing useful for Sarah's case. The investigator's report actually praised my parenting, noting my consistent presence at school, evinced Jake's obvious happiness and security, and our strong father-son bond. But attached to the report was a note from Sarah instructing the investigator to be more creative in his observations and suggesting specific incidents that could be reported as concerning. "You hired someone to spy on my son," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. You had strangers following a 10-year-old boy hoping to manufacture evidence that he was in danger. Sarah's face had gone completely pale, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered. I was concerned about Jake's welfare. A single father working multiple jobs, no female influence in his life, no stability. "What stability, E?" I shot back. "Jake has lived in the same house his entire life. He's attended the same school since kindergarten. He has the same best friends, the same bedroom, the same bedtime stories every night. The only instability in his life comes from family members who make him feel unwanted at his own grandfather's birthday party." But perhaps the most chilling document in Sarah's collection was a detailed timeline titled Custody Transition Plan. It outlined exactly how she intended to implement her scheme, starting with the fabricated reports to Child Protective Services, followed by emergency custody placement, and culminating in a permanent adoption that would legally make Jake her son rather than her nephew. The plan even included strategies for limiting my contact with Jake during the transition period, gradually reducing visits until our relationship was completely severed. Sarah had calculated that a traumatized 10-year-old would eventually bond with his new family situation, especially if his memories of his previous life were consistently undermined and reframed as unhappy or unhealthy. "This isn't about Jake's welfare at all," Uncle Robert said, his voice filled with disgust as he read through the custody timeline. "This is about money and manipulation. You were planning to steal Ernest's son to secure your position as Dad's primary heir." The room fell silent as the full scope of Sarah's conspiracy became clear. She hadn't just been lying about me or stealing from our father or tormenting my late wife. She'd been orchestrating the complete destruction of my family, planning to take my son away and erase my existence from his life, all in service of her greed and jealousy. Jake's small voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Dad, I don't understand. Why would Aunt Sarah want to hurt us so much?" It was a question that had no satisfactory answer. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that his aunt was willing to destroy his entire world just to get her hands on money that might or might not come to her someday? The overwhelming flood of revelations about Sarah's schemes appeared to be taking a physical toll on my father. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, his face flushing an alarming shade of red as he gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. Beads of sweat formed across his forehead despite the restaurant's cool air conditioning. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, moving toward him with growing concern. He tried to wave me away, but his hand trembled violently as he brought it to his chest, his eyes wide with what looked like panic or pain. The stress of learning that one daughter had been systematically lying to him, stealing from him, and plotting to destroy his relationship with his son and grandson was clearly overwhelming his 70-year-old system. "I think we need to call paramedics," Uncle Robert announced, already pulling out his phone. Several family members jumped into action, clearing space around Dad's chair and loosening his collar while someone flagged down the restaurant manager. As we waited for emergency responders, Dad's breathing gradually stabilized, but his color remained poor and his hands continued shaking. The paramedics arrived within minutes, professional and efficient, as they checked his vital signs and asked questions about his medical history. "Blood pressure's elevated, but not dangerously so," one of the EMTs reported. "Heart rate's a bit fast, but steady. Looks like a stress response rather than a cardiac event. But we should transport him for evaluation just to be safe." "No," Dad said firmly, his voice hoarse but determined. "I'm not going anywhere until this is finished. I need to understand what's been happening to my family." The lead paramedic frowned but began setting up a portable monitor to keep track of Dad's vitals while he insisted on staying at the restaurant. As the EMT attached sensors to his chest, Dad gestured for me to come closer. "Ernest, I need you to know something." He whispered, his voice so quiet that I had to lean in to hear him. "I haven't been completely fooled by Sarah's manipulation. Something's been feeling wrong for months. but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The admission surprised me. I'd assumed that Sarah's lies had been completely effective, that Dad had genuinely believed I was an inadequate father, and that Jake was somehow less worthy of his attention. About 6 weeks ago, I started feeling like someone was pulling my strings. Dad continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. Sarah's daily phone calls, always with some new concern about you, or Jake, always painting herself as the reasonable, stable daughter while you were supposedly falling apart. It felt orchestrated, manipulative. He paused, wincing slightly as the EMT adjusted one of the monitoring sensors. So I decided to do some investigating of my own. I've been watching you and Jake without telling anyone, seeing if Sarah's stories matched reality. The revelation that my father had been conducting his own surveillance operation was both touching and heartbreaking. While Sarah was hiring private investigators to manufacture evidence against me, Dad was personally observing our daily life to determine the truth for himself. "What did you see?" I asked, though I was confident in what his answer would be. "I saw a devoted father and a happy, healthy child." Dad replied, his eyes filling with tears. "I saw you reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, cooking dinner together every night. I saw Jake running to greet you after school, like you were the most important person in his world. I saw a family that works." The knowledge that Dad had witnessed our genuine relationship while Sarah was trying to convince him it was dysfunctional made her betrayal even more painful. She'd been lying to a man who was actively seeking the truth, manipulating someone who was already beginning to doubt her stories. "There's something else?" Dad continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Last month, I changed my will. I divided everything equally between you, Sarah, and Robert. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's constant focus on inheritance matters was corrupting her judgment about family relationships." The irony was staggering. While Sarah was plotting and scheming to secure her position as Dad's primary heir, he'd already decided to distribute his estate equally among his children. Her elaborate conspiracy had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. But here's what I didn't understand until tonight. Dad's eyes hardened as he looked across the room at Sarah, who was huddled with Marcus near the restaurant's entrance. "I've been feeling manipulated, but I thought the manipulation was subtle, psychological. I had no idea she was outright lying to me, stealing from me, and plotting to destroy your family." The paramedic monitoring Dad's vitals frowned at a spike in his heart rate and gently suggested that we postpone the conversation until his stress levels decreased. But Dad was determined to finish what he'd started. "Ernest, I owe you and Jake an enormous apology," he said, his voice carrying across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've allowed myself to be influenced by lies and manipulation, even when my own observations contradicted what I was being told. I've hurt my grandson's feelings and damaged our relationship because I didn't trust my own instincts about the truth." Jake had been standing quietly beside me throughout Dad's medical evaluation. But now, he stepped forward with the innocent courage that children sometimes display in difficult situations. "Grandpa, are you going to be okay?" he asked, his small hand reaching out to touch Dad's arm gently. The simple question and gesture seemed to affect Dad more powerfully than any of the evening's dramatic revelations. His eyes filled with fresh tears as he looked down at his grandson, seeing perhaps for the first time the loving, caring child that Sarah's lies had tried to obscure. "I'm going to be fine, Jake," Dad replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And from now on, I'm going to make sure you know exactly how much your grandfather loves you and how proud he is to be your grandpa." The moment of connection between Jake and his grandfather was interrupted by a commotion near the restaurant's entrance. Sarah and Marcus were apparently preparing to leave, gathering their daughters and heading for the door. But Uncle Robert blocked their path, his expression grim and determined. "You're not going anywhere," Robert announced. "We're calling the police right now to report the theft from Dad's accounts. This family has had enough of your lies and manipulation." Sarah's face cycled through a range of expressions: panic, calculation, desperation, and finally a cold determination that was somehow more frightening than her earlier emotional outbursts. "You have no proof of anything," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Dad gave me access to his accounts because he was concerned about Ernest's financial situation. I was protecting his money from being stolen, not stealing it myself." The audacity of her continued lies, even in the face of Marcus's drunken confessions and the overwhelming evidence against her, was breathtaking. But Dad's voice cut through her protestations with surprising strength. "Sarah, stop lying. I never gave you access to my accounts. I never authorized any withdrawals. And after tonight, you're no longer welcome in my home, my life, or my will." The finality in his words seemed to break something in Sarah's composure. The mask of concerned sister and devoted daughter finally fell away, completely revealing the cold, calculating person she'd been hiding underneath. The next few hours passed in a blur of police reports, financial investigations, and legal consultations. Sarah's theft from Dad's accounts was thoroughly documented, with bank records showing a clear pattern of unauthorized withdrawals that coincided perfectly with Marcus's gambling debts. The forged signatures on withdrawal slips were obvious when compared to Dad's actual handwriting, and the fabricated custody documents in her purse provided additional evidence of her criminal intent. Detective Maria Santos, who responded to our call, was thorough and professional as she gathered statements from family members and examined the evidence. Sarah's attempt to claim that Dad had authorized the withdrawals fell apart when bank security footage showed her forging signatures in the parking lot before entering the bank. "Mrs. Henderson, you're under arrest for elder financial abuse, forgery, and fraud," Detective Santos announced as she read Sarah her rights. "The sight of my sister being led away in handcuffs while her teenage daughters cried quietly in the background was both satisfying and heartbreaking." Marcus was arrested separately for public intoxication and as an accessory to the financial crimes. The couple who had spent years plotting to destroy my family was finally facing consequences for their actions. In the days that followed, the full scope of Sarah's crimes became clear. She'd stolen nearly $37,000 from Dad's accounts over the course of 8 months' money that was intended to fund his retirement and medical care. Her elaborate custody conspiracy included forged medical records, fabricated school reports, and false statements that could have sent an innocent man to prison while traumatizing a child. But perhaps most importantly, Charlotte's revelation about Lisa's death prompted authorities to investigate whether Sarah's psychological torture could be considered a contributing factor in the cardiac arrest that killed my wife. While criminal charges related to Lisa's death were complicated by the passage of time, the knowledge that Sarah had deliberately caused the stress that led to my wife's fatal heart attack provided a sense of closure I'd never expected to find. Dad's recovery from the stress episode was swift and complete, aided by his relief at finally understanding the truth about his family dynamics. The guilt he felt about nearly losing his relationship with Jake motivated him to make dramatic changes in how he approached his role as grandfather. Within a week of Sarah's arrest, Dad had moved into a small apartment just 3 blocks from our house, citing a desire to be more involved in Jake's daily life. The change was remarkable. Instead of the distant, occasionally judgmental grandfather, Jake had known he suddenly had a constant presence who attended every school event, helped with homework, and showed genuine interest in his activities. "Dad, why did Grandpa never want to spend time with me before?" Jake asked one evening as we watched through the kitchen window while Dad helped him build a tree house in our backyard. "Grandpa always wanted to spend time with you," I explained, choosing my words carefully. Aunt Sarah was telling him lies that made him confused about our family. "Now that he knows the truth, he can show you how much he really loves you." The transformation in their relationship was beautiful to witness. Dad seemed determined to make up for lost time, creating new traditions and memories with Jake that would last a lifetime. They went fishing every Saturday morning, worked together in the garden Dad had planted in our yard, and spent hours looking through old photo albums while Dad shared stories about Jake's mother that I'd never heard before. One particularly meaningful moment came when Dad presented Jake with a college fund that he'd established exclusively for him, separate from any inheritance considerations. "This is just between us, grandson," Dad explained. "Your education is the most important gift I can give you, and I want you to know that your future is secure no matter what happens." The legal proceedings against Sarah and Marcus moved forward steadily. Sarah pleaded guilty to the financial crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence, agreeing to pay full restitution plus interest. Marcus entered a court-ordered gambling treatment program as part of his plea agreement. Both of them were prohibited from contacting Dad or coming near our family. Emma and Grace, Sarah's daughters, were the innocent victims of their parents' crimes. Dad stepped in to help support their college educations, recognizing that they shouldn't be punished for their mother's actions. The girls chose to maintain a relationship with our side of the family while distancing themselves from their parents' toxic behavior. The ripple effects of that horrible birthday dinner extended far beyond criminal justice. Our extended family, which had been slowly fragmenting under the influence of Sarah's lies and manipulation, came together stronger than ever. Family gatherings became celebrations of truth and genuine connection rather than exercises in managing hidden resentments and manufactured conflicts. Jake blossomed under the attention and love of family members who finally saw him clearly. His confidence grew as he realized that the distance he'd felt from some relatives had nothing to do with his own worth and everything to do with lies that were being told about him. He excelled in school, made new friends, and developed a sense of security about his place in the world that had been missing before. Uncle Robert took over managing Dad's finances, implementing safeguards to prevent future elder abuse, while ensuring Dad maintained his independence. Aunt Charlotte became a regular presence in our lives, sharing stories about Lisa that helped Jake understand his mother's love for him and the circumstances of her death in age-appropriate ways. The most profound change was in my own relationship with Dad. For years, I'd felt like I was constantly defending my parenting choices and proving my worth as a son. The revelation that Sarah had been systematically poisoning his mind against me freed us both to build the relationship we'd always wanted but had been prevented from having. Ernest, I need you to know how proud I am of the man you've become and the father you are, Dad said one evening as we sat on the front porch, watching Jake practice pitching with a neighbor friend. "You've raised an extraordinary boy under impossible circumstances, and you've done it with grace and strength that I should have recognized and celebrated instead of questioning. The healing process wasn't always smooth or simple. There were moments when the weight of everything we'd lost, Lisa, the years of strained family relationships, Jake's sense of security, this felt overwhelming. But we faced those challenges together as a family, united by truth rather than divided by lies. 6 months after that terrible birthday dinner, we held a celebration for Dad's 71st birthday. This time the gathering was smaller but infinitely more meaningful. When Dad raised his glass for a toast, his words were carefully chosen and deeply felt. "To my grandson Jake, who has taught me that love isn't about perfection or meeting other people's expectations. It's about showing up, being present, and choosing family over everything else. And to my son Ernest, who has demonstrated every day what it means to be a devoted father and a man of integrity. You are both my greatest gifts." Jake beamed as the family applauded, finally hearing the words he'd waited his whole life to receive from his grandfather. The pain of that earlier birthday had been transformed into a foundation for genuine love and connection. As I watched my son laugh with his grandfather and cousins, I reflected on the lessons we'd learned through this ordeal. Truth has power that lies cannot ultimately overcome. Family bonds built on honesty and love are stronger than those manipulated through fear and deception. And sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most beautiful redemptions. Jake approached me as the evening wound down his face, serious despite the celebration around us. "Dad, I'm glad Aunt Sarah got caught. Not because I want her to be sad, but because now everyone knows the truth about us." His simple wisdom captured something profound about our journey. We hadn't sought revenge or destruction, we'd sought truth and justice. The consequences Sarah faced were the natural result of her own choices, not punishments we'd imposed out of spite. Today, our lives are fuller and richer than they've ever been. Jake has the grandfather he always deserved. I have the father I'd always hoped for. And our family gatherings are filled with genuine joy rather than hidden tensions. Sarah's attempt to destroy us ultimately made us stronger, more connected, and more grateful for the love we share. The greatest victory wasn't seeing Sarah face consequences for her crimes, though justice was important. The greatest victory was watching Jake grow up confident in his worth, surrounded by family members who celebrate his existence rather than merely tolerating it. Every bedtime story, every school project, every shared meal is a reminder that truth and love will always triumph over lies and manipulation. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you trusted was working against you behind the scenes? How did you handle discovering the truth about their betrayal? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own family struggles, please hit the like button and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about the power of standing up for truth and family. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming adversity and finding strength in unexpected places. Remember, no matter what challenges you're facing with family relationships or trust issues, there's always hope for healing and redemption when we choose honesty over convenience and love over fear. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and may your own family bonds grow stronger through whatever trials you face.